In the grim, mud-choked landscape of the Western Front in late 1944, a specter haunted the Allied soldier. It was a creature of steel and fire, a beast whispered about in hushed, anxious tones from the hedgerows of Normandy to the frozen forests of the Ardennes. Its official name was the Panzerkampfwagen 6 Ausf B Tiger II. But to the men who faced it, and to the world that read about it in terrifying propaganda, it was known by a name that inspired both awe and dread: the Königstiger, the King Tiger. This was not merely a tank, it was a psychological weapon of immense power. The myth of the King Tiger was carefully cultivated by the Nazi propaganda machine, designed to project an image of German technological invincibility even as the Reich crumbled on all fronts. Newsreels showed its colossal, slab-sided form rolling effortlessly through battered villages, its impossibly long 8.8 cm KWK 43 cannons spewing destruction. It was presented as an unstoppable force, a moving fortress that could annihilate any Allied tank from distances so great that return fire was futile. The very name, King Tiger, was chosen to evoke a sense of primal, regal dominance on the battlefield. The statistics on paper seemed to justify the fear. The King Tiger was the heaviest production tank of the war, a behemoth weighing in at nearly 70 tons. Its frontal armor was a nightmarish puzzle for Allied gunners. The glacis plate was 150 millimeters of sloped steel, making it virtually impervious to the standard 75 millimeter guns of the Sherman tank from any frontal angle. Its turret, a massive curved casting for early models, or the sharper, harder-to-penetrate Porsche turret for later ones, was equally formidable. And then there was the gun. The 8.8 cm KWK-43 was a masterpiece of ballistic engineering, a weapon capable of piercing over 200 millimeters of armor at 1,000 meters. In a direct confrontation on open ground, the King Tiger held every advantage. A Sherman crew would have to be impossibly brave or desperately lucky to close the distance and hope for a flanking shot, all while under the threat of a shell that could obliterate their vehicle with a single hit. This myth of invincibility was amplified by the battlefield accounts that filtered back. A single King Tiger, well positioned, could hold off an entire Allied armored column, picking off tanks one by one, while enemy shells simply bounced harmlessly off its thick hide. These stories, often exaggerated in the retelling, became legend. For the American tank crew, the order Tiger was the most terrifying they could receive. It meant they were facing something that outclassed them in every measurable aspect of direct combat: armor, firepower, and range. The psychological impact was profound, creating a phenomenon known as Tiger phobia, where any German tank, from a Panzer IV to a Stug III, was reported as a dreaded tiger. Yet this myth was a carefully constructed facade, a Potemkin village of military might. The reality of the King Tiger was far more complex and deeply flawed. What the propaganda films did not show were the immense logistical chains required to keep such a beast operational. They did not show the specialized recovery vehicles needed to tow its staggering weight when it became immobilized, which was often. They did not show the strained final drive assemblies, the overburdened engines, and the insatiable thirst for fuel that a fleet of King Tigers imposed on a German war economy that was being systematically bombed into rubble. The myth was one of quality over quantity, a narrative that Berlin was desperate to promote. It was a symbol of German ingenuity defying the overwhelming material superiority of the Allies. Each King Tiger was a knight, a champion sent forth to slay hordes of lesser tanks. This narrative was a powerful tool for morale, both at home and at the front. But like many myths, it was built on a fragile foundation, one that ignored the brutal, unglamorous laws of physics, mechanics, and industrial production. The king tiger was not just a weapon, it was a statement. And in the winter of 1944, a group of American soldiers was about to get a close, hands-on education in the vast chasm that separated the terrifying myth from the deeply flawed reality. The legend of the invincible tiger was about to meet the cold, hard truth of a broken-down engine and a handful of stunned GIs. The context for the capture of a king tiger was not one of sweeping German offensives, but of chaotic, grinding retreat. By the late summer and autumn of 1944, the Wehrmacht in the West was a shattered force, reeling from the collapse of the Normandy front and a headlong rush back towards the borders of the Reich itself. The once proud panzer divisions, their ranks filled with a mix of battered veterans and untested replacements, were shadows of their former selves. They fought a series of desperate, delaying actions, trading space for time in a vain hope to stabilize the front. It was within this cauldron of disorganization, fuel shortages, and Allied air superiority that the opportunity to capture such a legendary prize could even arise. A fully functional, supported king tiger in a coordinated attack was a near unstoppable force. A king tiger in retreat, however, was a vulnerable, mechanical white elephant. The circumstances leading to the capture were almost certainly born of desperation and mechanical failure. Perhaps it was during the frantic German withdrawal from France after the Falaise pocket, where the roads became graveyards of abandoned vehicles. Maybe it was in the early stages of the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest, where the difficult wooded terrain and atrocious weather negated the tiger's long-range advantages and played havoc with its complex machinery. Or it could have been further north as the Allies pushed towards the German border. The specific location is less important than the universal situation. The German army was in flight, and its heaviest, most cumbersome vehicles were the most likely to be left behind. The sequence of events would have been a stark contrast to the propaganda reels. A king tiger, part of a rearguard action, or simply trying to extricate itself from an advancing Allied pincer movement, would have succumbed to one of its many inherent weaknesses. The most likely culprit was fuel exhaustion. The Tiger II was a glutton, its 700-horsepower Maybach engine consuming astronomical amounts of precious petrol for a country whose synthetic fuel plants were primary targets for Allied bombers. A crew, rather than letting their magnificent tank fall into enemy hands intact, would ideally destroy it with a carefully placed explosive charge in the breech of the gun or the engine compartment. But in the chaos of a retreat, under fire, and with American infantry or armor closing in, the time or the means for a proper demolition might not have been available. Another, even more probable scenario was a catastrophic mechanical failure. The Tiger II's final drive, the component that transferred power from the engine to the tracks, was notoriously fragile and grossly overstressed by the tank's immense weight. A failure here would render the behemoth instantly immobile, a 70-ton pillbox. The engine itself, pushed to its limits by the constant strain, could seize or break down. A thrown track, a task that was a Herculean effort for its crew even under ideal conditions, became an impossibility under artillery fire or the threat of enemy infantry. The transmission, another weak point, could give out. Any one of these failures would leave the tank stranded. It is this second scenario, a sudden, immobilizing breakdown, that best fits the narrative of a capture that stunned its discoverers. Imagine an American reconnaissance unit, perhaps a platoon of M5 Stuart light tanks, or a company of infantry riding on M3 half-tracks, advancing cautiously through a recently abandoned sector. They would be expecting rearguard sniper fire, perhaps a hidden Panzerfaust team, or the occasional mine. What they would not expect to find is the apex predator of the German Armored Corps, the legendary King Tiger, sitting silent and apparently abandoned in a field or by the side of a road. There would be no signs of battle damage from an enemy shell, no scorch marks from a crew-initiated fire. It would just be there. The initial reaction of the American soldiers would have been one of extreme caution and disbelief. The silhouette of the King Tiger was unmistakable and terrifying. Every instinct, honed by months of brutal combat and the pervasive tiger phobia, would scream that this was a trap. They would have expected the long, deadly barrel of the 80-millimeter gun to swing towards them at any moment. They would have surrounded the vehicle, weapons trained on the hatches, waiting for a shot that never came. After tense minutes, it would become clear that the beast was not sleeping, but paralyzed. The greatest prize of the armored war, a weapon they had feared and respected in equal measure, had been delivered unto them not by a heroic duel of steel, but by its own inherent frailty. The hunter had not been bested. It had simply collapsed. The chase was over before it even began, and the trophy was there for the taking, a monument to a broken war machine and a dying regime. The moment of capture was not a dramatic, explosive climax, but a slow, tense, and profoundly surreal anticlimax. The American soldiers, likely a combined force of infantry and perhaps a few armored vehicles from a reconnaissance unit, did not storm the immobilized King Tiger. Instead, they approached it with the wary caution of hunters circling a wounded, but potentially still dangerous, grizzly bear. The sheer scale of the tank was the first thing to strike them. From a distance, it was a menacing silhouette. Up close, it was a sheer cliff of steel, towering over their own M4 Shermans and dwarfing the men on the ground. The iconic long 88mm gun, which they knew could kill from over 2 miles away, was frozen in place, its menace neutralized by an invisible internal failure. The process of securing the vehicle was a masterclass in infantry tactics applied to a static steel fortress. The GIs would have fanned out, establishing a perimeter with their M1 Garands and bars pointed not just at the tank, but at the surrounding woods and hedgerows, expecting a German counterattack or a sniper team left behind to protect the valuable asset. Only a small, brave team would have closed in on the tank itself. Their hearts would have been pounding, every sense heightened. The silence was the most unnerving part. There was no rumble of the engine, no clanking of tracks, no voices from within, just the sound of the wind and their own cautious footsteps in the mud. The hatches were the key. Were they locked from the inside? Was the crew still there, waiting in ambush? The lead soldier with his Thompson submachine gun or M1 carbine at the ready would have reached up, his hand touching the cold, painted steel. The clunk of the hatch opening would have echoed in the tense silence. He would have thrown it back, aiming his weapon into the dark interior, ready for a burst of fire or the blast of a grenade. But there would have been nothing. only the dim, eerie emptiness of the fighting compartment. The crew was gone. They had likely fled on foot, either during the night or at the first sign of the American approach, knowing that to stay with their broken-down behemoth was to face certain capture or death. They had abandoned their post, leaving behind one of the most advanced weapons of the war. With the tank confirmed empty, the mood would have shifted from tense apprehension to bewildered curiosity. The Americans now swarmed over the vehicle, not as combatants, but as explorers discovering a strange and alien artifact. They would have poked their heads inside the open hatches, peering into the cramped, complex interior. The smell would have hit them first, a unique mixture of cold oil, diesel fuel, cordite, sweat, and stale German tobacco. The space was a stark contrast to the utilitarian interior of a Sherman. It was dark, crowded with ammunition racks, the massive breech of the main gun, and complex German instrumentation labeled in Gothic script. This was the moment of intimate discovery. The GIs would have run their hands over the thick, sloped armor of the glacis plate, a surface that had been described to them as impenetrable. They would have marveled at the sheer size of the 88mm shells, each one a heavy, polished brass and steel cylinder of death. They would have sat in the commander's seat, peering through the sophisticated optics, understanding immediately why German gunners were so accurate. They would have found personal effects of the crew, a forgotten photograph, a half-eaten piece of black bread, a diary, a map. These mundane items were a haunting reminder that this terrifying machine was operated by men not so different from themselves, men who were now fleeing for their lives. The initial inspection would have quickly revealed the reason for the abandonment. There were no gaping holes from an Allied shell, no evidence of internal fire or explosion. The exterior was pristine, a testament to its armor's ability to withstand their own tank guns. The problem was internal. Perhaps a quick look into the engine compartment accessible from the rear would show the mechanics the issue. The massive Maybach engine might have been cold and silent, but a trained eye could see a seized piston, a cracked block, or a catastrophic failure in the complex transmission linkage. The tracks were intact, but the drive sprockets were motionless, disconnected from the source of their power. The beast hadn't been slain. It had suffered a massive internal mechanical heart attack. The capture was complete. They had taken the ultimate prize without firing a single shot at it. Radio calls would have gone back to headquarters, sparking a mixture of disbelief and excitement. The order would have been clear. Secure the vehicle. Do not let it be recaptured. Technical intelligence is on the way. The American soldiers, now standing guard over their silent trophy, would have felt a complex mix of emotions: triumph, relief, and a growing sense of irony. They had been trained to fear this machine, to sacrifice Shermans to destroy it. Yet here it was, handed to them by its own inherent fragility. The myth of the invincible tiger was still potent, but as they leaned against its cold, immobile hull, the first cracks in that legend were beginning to show. The king of the battlefield was a prisoner, and its shackles were not made of steel, but of its own flawed engineering. The initial euphoria of capturing the king tiger intact soon gave way to a more practical and pressing objective: moving it. The vehicle was a priceless intelligence windfall, but it was useless if it remained stranded in no man's land, a vulnerable target for German artillery or recovery attempts. The order from higher command would have been unequivocal. Get the Tiger II to a secure rear area for thorough examination and testing. It was this seemingly straightforward task recovery that would reveal the fundamental weaknesses of the German behemoth and transform the American soldier's awe into a sense of profound, almost pitying understanding. The first and most immediate challenge was the King Tiger's sheer, staggering weight. At nearly 70 tons, it was more than double the weight of the standard M4 Sherman, and far beyond the capacity of the standard American recovery vehicles, the M25 Dragon Wagon or the M19 tank transporter. The very mass that made it impervious to gunfire now made it a logistical nightmare. The ground, softened by autumn rains or winter frost, threatened to swallow the tank whole if any attempt was made to tow it through a field. The only viable option was a hard-surfaced road, but even that was not a simple solution. The American engineers and tank crews would have approached the problem with their characteristic can-do attitude, a mindset forged in a culture of standardization and practical mechanics. They would have deployed their heaviest recovery vehicles, likely multiple M26 Dragon Wagons, and attached the thick steel tow cables to the Tiger's massive towing lugs. The engines of the recovery vehicles would roar, straining against their gears. The cables would tighten, vibrating with immense tension. And then, nothing. The King Tiger would have remained stubbornly, immovably planted. Or in a more disastrous scenario, there would have been a sickening crunch of metal. Not from the Tiger, but from the American recovery vehicle, its transmission or drivetrain shattered by the impossible load it was trying to move. The behemoth was not just heavy, it was fundamentally incompatible with the Allied recovery infrastructure, which was designed for a war of mobility and mechanics, not of monumental static fortresses. As the recovery effort stalled, a closer inspection of the stranded giant provided the real education. The American mechanics, peering into the engine compartment with their flashlights, would have found the root cause of the breakdown. The Maybach HL 230 P30 engine, a 12-cylinder gasoline powerhouse, was itself a masterpiece of engineering, but it was critically overstressed. Designed for a tank weighing 45 and 50 tons, it was being asked to propel 70. The evidence of this strain would have been clear. Perhaps a cracked cylinder head from chronic overheating, a seized piston from the immense pressure, or a failed bearing that had given way under the constant, brutal load. The engine was the heart of the tank, and this heart had failed under the burden of its own body. But the mechanical revelations went deeper. The transmission, another component operating far beyond its intended capacity, was a likely culprit. The crew might have reported that the tank simply stopped moving, the engine still running, but the power no longer reaching the tracks. This pointed directly to the final drive unit, the component that transferred power from the transmission to the tracks. In the King Tiger, this was the Achilles heel, a notoriously fragile assembly that was the subject of frequent failure reports, even in German service logs. The Americans would have discovered that these final drives, manufactured with precision but without the necessary margin for the tank's extreme weight, had a operational lifespan measured in mere dozens of kilometers, especially under the harsh conditions of cross-country travel or rapid maneuvering. The suspension system, the intricate overlapping road wheels copied from the earlier Tiger I, also revealed its flaws. While providing excellent cross-country performance, this Schachtel auf Werk design was a maintenance horror. a single damaged wheel required the removal of several others to access it. In the muddy, debris-ridden conditions of the European battlefield, mud, rocks, and frozen earth would pack solidly between the wheels, immobilizing them, and in the Russian winter, freezing into concrete hard blocks. The American GIs, accustomed to the simple, easy-to-maintain suspension of the Sherman, would have looked at this complex system with a mixture of disbelief and derision. It was engineering for the sake of engineering, not for the sake of the mechanic in a muddy field with a hammer and a wrench. As they worked, the initial image of the flawless, invincible superweapon began to crumble, replaced by the reality of a deeply flawed machine. The Americans saw firsthand the price the Germans paid for their obsession with armor and firepower. They saw a vehicle so complex, so over-engineered, and so mechanically delicate that it could not even complete a basic strategic road march without breaking down. The weakness was not in its armor or its gun, but in its very soul, in the fragile mechanical components that were never meant to bear the burden placed upon them. The King Tiger was revealed not as a warrior, but as an invalid, a giant whose own body was too heavy for its bones and muscles to support. The Iron Beast's greatest weakness was, ironically, its own immense strength. The discovery of the immobilized King Tiger presented the Americans with more than just a tactical curiosity. It offered a profound case study in the fundamental differences between their own and the German war-making philosophies. As engineers and intelligence officers pored over the captured beast, a critical question emerged. Was the King Tiger's failure the result of a specific, correctable design flaw, or was it the inevitable symptom of a much larger systemic collapse? The answer, they soon realized, was both. The broken-down tank was a microcosm of the entire German war effort in late 1944, a terrifying display of technical brilliance shackled to a foundation of strategic bankruptcy and industrial desperation. On one level, the tank's vulnerabilities were indeed specific design flaws. The under-engineered final drive, the overstressed transmission, and the inadequate engine were clear examples of mechanical components that had not been sufficiently upgraded to match the tank's colossal weight. The German engineers at Henschel had created a masterpiece of armor and ballistics, but the powertrain was its tragic afterthought. The overlapping road wheel system, while excellent for distributing weight and providing a smooth ride, was a testament to a design philosophy that prioritized ultimate performance at the cost of maintainability. In the clean, controlled environment of a testing ground, these features might have been manageable. On the Eastern Front, caked in frozen mud, or on the dusty, cratered roads of France, they became crippling liabilities. This was engineering in a vacuum, a pursuit of theoretical perfection that ignored the brutal, dirty reality of war. However, to view these flaws in isolation was to miss the larger picture. These design decisions were not made in a void. They were forced upon German industry by the strategic and material circumstances of the Third Reich. The King Tiger was not a weapon designed for a long war of attrition. It was a weapon of desperation, a wonder weapon, Wunderwaffe, intended to have such a qualitative edge that it could reverse the overwhelming quantitative superiority of the Allies. This philosophy of betting on technological miraces was a hallmark of the late war Nazi leadership. When you are losing thousands of tanks on the Eastern Front and your cities are being bombed around the clock, the appeal of a single, invincible tank that can destroy a dozen enemy vehicles is intoxicating. The King Tiger was the embodiment of this desperate gamble. This desperation was compounded by the catastrophic state of German war production. By 1944, Allied strategic bombing campaigns had systematically targeted the very industries that supported armored vehicle production. Factories manufacturing ball bearings, precision optics, engines, and electrical components were reduced to rubble. The synthetic fuel plants that powered the Wehrmacht were primary targets. The King Tiger, captured by the Americans, might have rolled off the assembly line just as its supply of critical high-quality alloys was being cut off. The skilled laborers who once meticulously fitted its complex transmission might have been conscripted into the Volkssturm or killed in an air raid, replaced by forced laborers from occupied territories with little incentive for quality control. The tank's breakdown, therefore, might not have been due to a flaw in the blueprint, but to a substandard batch of steel in the final drive, rushed assembly, or improper heat treatment of a gear, all symptoms of an industrial base in its death throes. Furthermore, the German logistical system, which in 1940 had been a model of efficiency, was by 1944 in a state of near total collapse. The King Tiger was a logistical nightmare, even when everything worked. It required special rail cars and reinforced bridges for transport. Its enormous fuel consumption made it a liability in an army that was chronically short of petrol. When one broke down, it required not one, but often 2 or 3 of the equally massive 18-ton Famo half-track recovery vehicles to even attempt a tow vehicles that were themselves rare and vulnerable. The abandoned King Tiger was a stark illustration of this logistical failure. Its crew didn't abandon it because they wanted to. They abandoned it because the entire support structure designed to keep it fighting. The recovery vehicles, the spare parts, the fuel trucks had likely already been destroyed, diverted, or had simply never arrived. Thus, the immobilized tank was more than just a broken machine. It was a symbol of the terminal contradiction at the heart of the late war German war machine. The pursuit of qualitative superiority without the industrial base, raw materials, or fuel to sustain it. The Americans, by contrast, had built their armored forces on a philosophy of good enough. The M4 Sherman was not the best tank in a one-on-one duel, but it was reliable, easy to produce in staggering numbers, simple to maintain in the field, and logistically sustainable. The broken-down King Tiger proved the ultimate superiority of the American system. It was a powerful lesson that a war, especially a massive continental war, is not won by a handful of perfect, finicky knights, but by thousands of reliable, sturdy workhorses. The design flaw was the fragile final drive. The broken system was the entire Nazi war economy that made such a flaw a catastrophic, rather than a merely inconvenient, failure. The captured King Tiger stood as a silent, rusting monument to the chasm between myth and truth. For the Allied soldiers who now examined it, and for the intelligence analysts who would later dissect its every component, this single vehicle became the ultimate debriefing. It systematically dismantled the legend of German invincibility, not through combat, but through the cold, hard evidence of its own failure. The reality uncovered was far more telling than any battlefield loss. It revealed a war machine that was fundamentally flawed, not by chance, but by the very philosophy that created it. The legend, carefully woven by propaganda and amplified by the genuine fear of frontline troops, was one of an unstoppable Goliath. It was a tank whose armor was a shield against any weapon, whose gun was a spear that could pierce any defense, and whose presence on the battlefield could single-handedly dictate the outcome of an engagement. This myth was so potent that it created a form of tactical paralysis, causing Allied commanders to commit disproportionate resources to counter the threat of a single King Tiger, its reputation often doing the work of an entire panzer division. The reality, as discovered in that muddy field, was starkly different. The armor, while formidable from the front, was not a magical shield. The Americans noted the quality of the steel, but they also understood its limitations. The tank's immense weight made it slow and cumbersome, an easy target for Allied fighter bombers like the P-47 Thunderbolt, which could disable it with rockets and cannon fire from above, where its armor was thinnest. Its side and rear armor, while still thick, were vulnerable to flanking attacks by more nimble Shermans and to dedicated infantry anti-tank weapons. The myth of its invulnerability was shattered by the understanding that it could be killed not just by a lucky shot, but through tactical maneuvering and air power. The gun, the legendary 88mm, was indeed a masterpiece of destruction. Its accuracy and penetrating power were everything the legends claimed, but the reality check came from considering its context. A gun is only as good as the platform that carries it. A broken-down King Tiger, stranded miles from the front, has a gun with a range of 0. Its terrifying potential was entirely nullified by the mechanical frailty of its chassis. Furthermore, the complex fire control system and sophisticated optics required a highly trained crew to operate effectively. By late 1944, the German army was bleeding these experienced crews dry, replacing them with hastily trained conscripts who could never hope to utilize the weapon to its full potential. The finest sword is useless in the hands of a dying man. The most profound lesson, however, was not about the King Tiger's components, but about the nature of modern industrial warfare. The Allied, and particularly the American victory, was not built on producing a handful of wonder weapons. It was built on a doctrine of overwhelming, sustainable production. The M4 Sherman was the antithesis of the King Tiger. It was not the best tank, but it was a good tank, and it existed in such staggering numbers that its qualitative shortcomings became almost irrelevant. The Sherman could be built by the tens of thousands, shipped across an ocean, and maintained by a 19-year-old mechanic from Ohio with basic training. Its parts were interchangeable, its design was simple, and its logistics were a smoothly oiled machine. When a Sherman broke down, it was fixed. When a King Tiger broke down, it was often abandoned, a total loss of a colossal investment of time, resources, and skilled labor. The broken-down King Tiger was the ultimate symbol of this disparity. It proved that quality, when pushed to an unsustainable extreme, becomes a fatal weakness. The German war machine had become a boutique manufacturer of exquisite, handcrafted weapons, while the Allies ran a brutal, efficient factory of war. The King Tiger was a Ferrari, magnificent on a perfect racetrack but useless in a muddy cross-country rally. The Sherman was a Jeep, a Studebaker truck, unglamorous, rugged, and everywhere. In the end, the legend of the King Tiger was a myth necessary for a regime built on myths. It was a story of Aryan technological supremacy, of the triumph of will over matter. The reality, as revealed by its capture, was a story of strategic folly, industrial collapse, and a profound misunderstanding of the nature of total war. The king, tiger, was not a warrior. It was a symptom. It was the final gasping breath of a military philosophy that valued the spectacular over the sustainable, the perfect over the good enough. Its silent, immobile hulk taught the Allies their most valuable lesson, that the war was not going to be won by a duel of champions, but by the relentless, grinding, and utterly dependable weight of production and logistics. The legend was fearsome, but the reality was a broken machine. And in that broken machine, the Allies saw the certain, inevitable defeat of the Third Reich.